Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah Cole, Associate Curator of Antiquities at the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles, California, home to the Getty's collection of Greek, Roman, and Etruscan art. Today's program complements the villa's current special exhibition, Sculpted Portraits from Ancient Egypt, which features works of art, notably portrait sculpture, from Egypt's 26th dynasty. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Egyptologist Dr. Campbell Price. Dr. Price is curator of Egypt and Sudan at Manchester Museum at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. And today he will be speaking with us about portrait sculpture from Egypt's late period. Please welcome Dr. Price.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. It's really a great pleasure to be asked to give this lecture. I'm just sorry that I'm not with you in the Getty Villa. Though when I visited 7 years ago, it was very nice and sunny. At the moment, I'm speaking to you from Liverpool in the United Kingdom, and it's dark, it's wet, and it's very windy. So I hope with some of what I'm going to do, we can transport ourselves back to ancient Egypt in considering some faces from the ancient Egyptian elite, which, as Sarah said, are currently on view in the exhibition Sculpted Portraits from Ancient Egypt at the Getty. One of the problems for us as Egyptologists, and especially for us working in museums, is that we not only try and supply context to try and recontextualize the objects in our care, but inevitably we recreate context based on our own opinions and our own cultural assumptions. So, what I want to do just now is, for 40 minutes or so, give you a sense of how the ancient Egyptians might have viewed sculpture in terms of interactions between the living and statues and between statues and the gods, but also to consider how our own judgments, our own prejudices have informed how that sculpture has been seen, how it's been viewed, how it's been evaluated. As a PhD student at the University of Liverpool, I wrote my PhD thesis on late period sculpture, non-royal sculpture. So when I met Sarah last year at a conference, I was desperate for the chance to be involved in the program of this exhibition. So I'm really grateful to Sarah and to all the organisers at the Getty for arranging this lecture. When we look at a piece such as this, we are immediately drawn to it. It is a human face. There is good psychological research about why we as human beings look at fellow human beings in the face. We are not so inclined to look at the hands or the feet or other body parts, but it's something about the face that really dominates Egyptology. You might say that the ancient Egyptian face has more associations with the whole culture of ancient Egypt than of the significance of the face in other cultures. If you say ancient Egypt, you can almost immediately picture an ancient Egyptian in your own mind. That comes partly from popular culture and partly from our own assumptions, of course. But because so much material, elite material, remember, material from the wealthy, from the top of society, has survived, so we can come face to face with the ancient Egyptians in an extraordinary way, in a way we can't for a lot of other ancient cultures. That, in part, is because the faces of the ancient Egyptians themselves, their mortal remains, their human remains have been inadvertently, in some cases, preserved through mummification. Mummification being a process of transformation in intention rather perhaps than preservation. But we have items like this, broken, intriguing, alluring, seductive faces that remind us of ourselves. And ultimately, this, I think, is why we are, a lot of us here, why many people will go and see this extraordinary exhibition of pieces from the British Museum. And it's what attracted me as a child. I remember going into a museum in my native city of Glasgow in Scotland and being enraptured by the ancient Egyptians that I encountered there. So what I'm saying to you now partly is based on considerations as a museum curator working in a popular UK museum, but also reflecting on work I did on sculpture for my PhD and thinking about, as part of an ongoing research project, how we figure the ancient Egyptians through techniques like facial reconstruction, through artificial intelligence, and through general cultural expectations of what the ancient Egyptians ought to look like. So, in taking this one example, piece made of a light quartzite, it's relatively unusual in the corpus that survives of many thousands of sculptures from pharaonic times, a period that stretches from around 3000 BCE through to the death of Cleopatra, say 30 BCE, and into the Roman period. So an incredibly long, productive period in human history. Of those enormous number of elite people commemorated, represented, materialized by statues, very few of them actually appear to us with a modern eye so lifelike. And this explains, perhaps unsurprisingly, why these particularly realistic faces, these lifelike faces with the creases and the dimples and the wrinkles and the signs of age have attracted the pens of so many Egyptologists. But I emphasize here that this is a museum piece. We are viewing this object not as it was originally conceived, not as it was originally displayed and installed and experienced in a temple, because the material in this exhibition and material mostly from the first millennium BCE, what Egyptologists call the late period of pharaonic history, most of that was not set up to be in a house in a domestic context. No, not at all. It wasn't even really by that period set up to be in a tomb. These are objects which were set up in temples. And this will be a concept I come back to. The temple is an extraordinarily competitive environment where you have to have some pretty sharp, stony, statuey elbows to nudge your competitors, your fellow statues out of the way, because that is in many ways a human characteristic. It's the nature of humanity in a society of a large number of people to want to stand out from the crowd. But how we relate that to modern concepts of individuality are quite complex. So what we're looking at here is not a complete representation of society. I emphasize this is really the top echelons of society who would even be allowed to be commemorated or even to have the resources to be able to command the production of a sculpture to be set up in a temple of the gods, where ultimately it was hoped you would be able to rub shoulders with those gods and ultimately join them and, in some sense, become a god. So, in this competitive environment, you needed to stand out. And as a result, these faces strike us today. So let's begin with some modern considerations. So this particular piece, British Museum EA 37883, mounted on a stand here. I've included this particular image deliberately because it really attests to its museumification. This is an object which is only a fragment of a much larger whole, a body-shaped whole, but we prize it today, perhaps because it is a fragment. When it was first described in print in the 1920s by a curator at the British Museum, H.R. Hall, he was almost falling over himself to jubilate in its decontextualization. He said it was in the fifth Egyptian room, the whole series of rooms in the British Museum dedicated to pharaonic material culture, on a special stand, as befits its preeminence as a work of art. So immediately, in print at least, we have this object being abstracted from its function as an object in a temple with various very important spiritual and religious and social functions, and being set up as an objet d'art, as a piece that was fitting to display in a modern Western museum. And Hall goes on at some length, I won't quote everything he says, to give an estimation not just of the piece, not just of the object, but of the person he believes it represents. He says, the evidence of the eyes and the mouth and the prominent bony structure of the skull are enough to show that the subject was aged. And the bust, he says bust, this was probably not its original function, is one of the finest Egyptian portraits of an old man that exists. It is very much the face of a typical British judge in his 70s. He goes on to say this may partly be because of the long wig, but nonetheless, Hall is claiming this object and claiming this person, which he assumes is a person represented true to life by the sculpture, into his own world. So Hall himself was an Englishman operating in the British Museum, and even as a jokey aside, it is a significant cultural judgment that he counts this person as British at a time when the British Empire was still controlling political action in Egypt itself. He says of the man, it is proud and composed, the face, the visage, yet not unhumorous. The mouth has a slightly ironical, almost quizzical smile, rendered with extraordinary subtlety. It is determined, yet by no means devoid of human kindness. Narrow in outlook, perhaps, but enlightened. In any case, it is the face of a most intelligent member of the ruling caste of his time that we can see at a glance. Now, we could unpick these statements for hours and hours, but I would just say it is typical, fairly typical, of judgments that were being made of Egyptian sculpture for a century before Hall was writing and continue to be made almost a century afterwards. Hall is very keen to stress that he has the eye and the ability and the authority to judge this person as a person. And it carries with it the rather sinister subtext of the judgment of human beings based on not just faces rendered in sculpture, but of human remains, of skulls in particular. And we know, especially in the UK, that the eugenics movement, championed by Egyptologists like William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who would have been known to Hall, this was part of an element of colonial control and of understanding and of absorbing ancient Egyptian culture into Western culture. It is true of lots of other pieces that are not featured in the exhibition. This is a particularly prominent example, variously described as one of the finest pieces of Egyptian portraiture to have survived from ancient times. It's now in Boston. The difficulty is when we use a word like portrait, it is convenient, but it has lots of modern associations. Portraits are things, pardon me, portraits are things which represent people as they are, as opposed to masks, say. A mummy mask is something which affects the divine status of the deceased, but in modern English parlance, a mask is something which covers the face, hides the face, especially since COVID, it stops people seeing who you are. But if this is to be understood as a portrait, then we have at least a subtext which assumes that this represents a living person. And in Egyptological writing, this has been a bar for success by which we judge the ancient Egyptian artist. If something is really good, it must represent something real, something in nature, someone as they actually were, a faithful likeness, a likeness which is rendered with fidelity. But in fact, it is true that ancient Egyptian art in general much more often references other ancient Egyptian art than it does reference back to nature. As has been said about this particular piece, and I can recommend a great book dedicated entirely to the fascinating story of this one museum object by Lawrence Berman of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Our attraction and our seduction to this little, much less than life-size head now in Boston is as much about its fragmentary status as it is about the quality or otherwise of the piece. Had the piece been preserved intact, had the statue been still attached to the body as it was originally conceptualized, then we probably wouldn't be talking about it quite so much. So here's a roughly contemporary sculpture, now in the British Museum, but not part of the current Getty show. A high official, a priest, a man at least acting in the capacity of a priest holding the image of a god. The body is standard. It is what we would expect of pharaonic art, known for centuries, millennia before this man lived. But the face has these contours of life, the cheeks, the jowls, the wrinkles, the frown of someone you could meet on the street. And this is held as a sign of reality. This must represent someone as they once actually had been. Perhaps the greatest example of these so-called realistic heads is this piece, the so-called Green Head, now in Berlin. Roughly life size, it is praised in lots of Egyptological writing and has been for many years. What you can't see at the back of the head is a distinctive trapezoidal shape at the upper part of a back pillar, a very distinctive element in ancient Egyptian sculpture throughout the Pharaonic period, but of great significance, theological significance, material significance for the integrity of the statue for eternity. That surface provided by a flat black back pillar at the rear of the sculpture provided a space for identification and also the space for inscriptions where the individual would be named, maybe the parents of the individual would be named, their titles would be given, and something might be said about their relationships to the gods. That writing affected the purpose of the sculpture, and I will come back to this point again, but it is forgotten when the sculpture is only preserved as just a head. And there is even evidence that in some cases, art dealers operating in the field, when they found a statue that was somewhat cumbersome, that had a rather attractive head, they'd break the head off to make it easier to carry and more appealing for the art market. More generally, though, it's worth saying that sculpture, especially of the Sayite period, and here is another example from the Getty show, was not so strikingly realistic. It was more conventional. It obeyed more closely the rules and the expectations and the canon of pharaonic art. So these realistic faces, these ones that show signs of age or fleshiness, or some might say personality, these would only ever have been in the minority. What really intrigued Egyptologists was the potential that the influence, the reason for the appearance of these so-called realistic heads could have been traced to the influence of Greece and Rome. Because from Greece and Rome, we have a set of busts here. An object, and by bust I mean a head or a head and neck, a head and shoulders, conceptualized as just that. It wasn't a broken part of a bigger piece, but just an object conceived of to represent the head and the shoulders. The mutual influence of these cultures and of these artistic traditions is much debated. And it was a subject espoused by the late great Egyptologist, German emigre, who moved moved to the United States in the Second World War and became really famous through his work collecting, collating, studying, publishing work from the late period, from the sculptural production of the first millennium BCE into the early Roman period. Now, Bottmer was a great believer that a sign of strength and vitality and skill was the representation of people as they actually were. And as in a lot of disciplines, certainly in Egyptology, some of his comments have stuck. Assessments perhaps initially offered simply as that, an initial assessment, have been taken as gospel. And so Bottmer's ideas about the quality of sculpture and the purpose of sculpture have cast a long shadow. And so I think when we look at these items, such as the ones in the Getty show today and on display until early 2027, we have to be aware of the cultural judgments of these people, largely modern Western art historians, judging the relative merits of a sculpture from a very different culture. So, in looking at this face with its very striking and alluring and magnetic features that could remind us of someone we might see passing in the street or someone we have known in our own lives, we have to be aware that part of our assessment, of course, is based on our own cultural baggage. And in Egyptological terms, it's also based on the previous assessments by older Egyptologists. The debate really has focused on influences from the broader Eastern Mediterranean rather than on the potential that these lifelike faces could have had ancient Egyptian antecedents. And by that, I mean pharaonic models by which they realized their own ideas in the temple. They looked back to ancient Egyptian experiments, perhaps, in the depiction of the human face. And the purposes of those depictions may not be what we expect. So, in the case of this sculpture, there's a very distinctive treatment of the wig framing the face. It has this kind of bunched quality, and we know this to have been attested from at least as early as the 18th century BCE. So please remember, if the dating for this piece is accurate, and I should say this is still a matter of debate. I've given quite a wide date range there. If, say, the piece dates from the 7th or the 6th century BCE, the influence, the model, the potential models for this piece may stretch back over 1,000 years. So we're really looking at a culture that was inundated with artistic models, that had a huge artistic heritage upon which to draw. And I really bring us back to that moment of being an ancient viewer, of being someone among the elect, among the initiated, who would be allowed into a space like the Temple of Karnak or the Temple of the god Ptah at Memphis. In that space, one would encounter not just the the representations of one's immediate ancestors, one's priestly ancestors, or the ancestors of one's colleagues. For I think it would be rather unusual to encounter the statue of a living contemporary. It seems the default position for most was a statue was set up posthumously once one had died. But in making that tour around a temple, you would encounter not just recent sculptures, but sculptures that dated back hundreds, if not thousands of years. So the models were definitely there. So let's take a couple to look at. This is one sculptural piece damaged actually in the Second World War from a direct hit to the Liverpool World Museum, which is a couple of miles down the road from where I'm speaking to you now. This shows the same, although it's damaged and worn, the same rather aged treatment of the face, hooded eyes, kind of jowly face, and the same distinctive treatment of the wig. I suspect our piece here probably originally had pointed wig lappets, as this piece does today. Another example that shows that in a better preserved condition is this very striking piece in quartzite now in Berlin. These were statues given probably as gifts of the royal court, if not directly of the king himself. Indeed, some of the sculptures are explicitly labeled, given as a favor, as a gift, as a present of the king. The ancient Egyptian term is hesud, and they belong to the upper echelons of society. If one lived in the Saite period around 600 BCE, to encounter one of these would be to encounter a successful ancestor, an effective ancestor, someone who had won at the game of representation and who was still being commemorated centuries after their death. Who amongst the elite of the late period wouldn't want to emulate or follow in the footsteps of one of these people? And by having one's image represented with the same appearance, with the same attributes, with the same wig, with the same style of face, perhaps one could achieve the same results. Here is an example now in Boston that shows, although again, Egyptologists are not absolutely of the same mind, which seems to show a sculpture of this period, 1800s BCE, showing one of these faces that seems to depart from the standardized pharaonic norm in a way that shows age, that shows experience, perhaps, that shows fleshiness, that shows something of a person. But if this kind of sculpture could have been encountered potentially at Memphis in the 600s BCE, it could surely have acted as a model for new sculpture makers in that later period. And so the idea of realism, as we perceive it now, need not have come from outside of Egypt, from Greece, or indeed from Rome. Those kind of faces are perhaps better known to those who are interested in Egyptian art from royal representations. So here you get some really striking faces. This is the very distinctive physiognomy of a king called Senwosret III, a king of the late 12th dynasty. Very distinctive because of his hooded eyes, his very big ears, his rather small and sad mouth, not entirely dissimilar from our own King Charles III. He's shown here, again, this is a piece on display in the British Museum that really illustrates the hoodedness of the eyes and the size of those ears, really massive ears. Now, many Egyptologists will tell you this is a sign of the political situation at the time. It has some kind of political or propagandistic message about the king being careworn, or the king being a listener, the king being concerned about the needs of his people. I'm pretty skeptical about that assessment myself. I don't think the king of ancient Egypt concerned himself much with the plight of the ordinary person. He was concerned perhaps about the elite, sure, the immediate court surrounding him, who might stick a knife in his back, or the audience he most wanted to endear himself to was among the gods, among the divine. So relationships, as we shall see, between human beings and the divine seem most important when we're talking about statuary. In fact, what I think is going on here, the distinctive face and particularly those ears may themselves, in the Middle Kingdom in the 1800s BCE, be themselves a throwback to a much earlier, an even earlier period of ancient Egyptian history, to the very, very first dynasties, the first representations of royalty in stone. So just to give you one example, the sculpture of a woman now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo shows these massive ears. The sculpture's in limestone, and we know that there are other sculptures which have these consciously archaizing features. By archaizing, I mean they deliberately employ, explicitly, ostentatiously, if you like, employ these features as a way of getting attention of an audience, as a way of demonstrating their knowledge, their access, their initiation, kind of a way of demonstrating a certain finesse or connoisseurship, maybe in a sense, but also demonstrating that timelessness of Egyptian art. And while generally I'm uncomfortable with the use of the term timelessness, because ancient Egyptian art absolutely is not timeless. You can see it change and move and see it for the dynamic cultural product that it was. There was an ancient concept of timelessness that was something one would want to tap into, to tune into. And as I've said, if you're aware of sculptures that are already hundreds, if not thousands of years old, by replicating them, you're not just doing it as a way of showing artistic finesse, but of really practically, seriously getting the same results, the same eternity for yourself, creating for yourself an eternal face. So rather than assuming this is what Senwosret III looked like, I think we should rather think what models might Senwosret III have had, what might his artisans have been drawing on, and what might they have been trying to effect, what purpose were they trying to achieve? And those same questions apply in the late period. When we look at those, say, out realistic portraits, rather than getting bogged down in questions of Greek and Roman influence, which may have played to an extent a part, let's also factor in indigenous Egyptian aspects of inspiration. So that brings me to a broader question, and it's one that I've surveyed in print before, but which I'd like to return to now, because I think it's something which is almost completely lost when one focuses just on the face. These are some sculptures now in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore that come from an extraordinary archaeological context, excavated in the early 20th century from the Temple of Karnak. The so-called Karnak cachette produced an extremely large range of sculptures, at least 1,000 statues in stone, most of them representing non-royal individuals. For my doctoral work, I looked at about 450 that related and represented people from the 25th dynasty, so around 750 BCE, through to the end of the Ptolemaic period, 30 BCE. And in analysing that, as a lot of PhD students do, I did some statistical analysis, and I discovered that the overall average height of one of those statues was actually rather small. It was less than, or in the region of, 40 centimeters or 16 inches in height. A colleague of mine who accompanied me on a trip to Egypt, Suzanne Arnold, I remember when we were at Karnak, she brought out a scale cardboard cutout of one of these statues and set it up. You can see it here in the image. And she subsequently supplied me with this photograph showing the Karnak Cachette courtyard. Under this courtyard is where these statues were found. And I show this just to demonstrate not only relatively how small these statues were, but how many could have been fitted into the space. I imagine the hundreds of sculptures that were found in the Karnak cachette were not simply all set up in this one courtyard, but were originally distributed around the whole Karnak complex and had at some point been gathered together for reasons that we are not quite clear on. But that issue of size is important because it allows us to revisit one of Bernard Bodmer's theories. When he was analysing late period sculpture for his master corpus, he was intrigued by the concept of apotheosis, the idea that these sculptures were deliberately looking up at the gods in the sky. Rather, perhaps, I would say, from a practical consideration, this was a means of engaging the attention not just of the divine, but of the living viewer. Because if we imagine most statues were rather small, if you were a living priest or priestess going through the sacred precincts of the temple, those statues might be best suited to have their chins slightly angled upwards in order to make eye contact. And eye contact clearly was of great importance. We have several texts that talk about the importance with contact between the sculpture and the living. So here's an example from the cachette, appealing to living ones upon earth, a whole series of different knowledgeable, literate priests, those who have taken up the palette, who are knowledgeable in hieroglyphs, those who see the statue and who give it offerings, because there was an expected interactivity. Once you've been honored with the dedication of a statue, as I say, most likely posthumously after one's death, you would hope that the statue would remain in place forever and would receive the attention of the living. So we have repeated examples of these so-called appeals to the living that explicitly specify the different types of people allowed entrance into the temple courtyard, and who it was hoped would give things, literally place offerings, food, drink, burn incense, chant hymns and prayers for the individual represented by the statue. And here, a really nice example where this individual asks not just for the performance of rituals, the burning of incense, the giving of water and offerings, but the removal of dust from the statue. Because the assumption is the living will have to wipe from him the remains of the offerings, so many and so plentiful will they be. And it brings to mind wonderful scenes that you can encounter today of people doing a bit of upkeep at the temples in Eastern Luxor today. But this is a practical consideration. Eternity is a long time, and you want to have an insurance that not only will your statue remain, but it will remain in a condition fit for an eternal, perfect, idealized existence, which will optimize your afterlife prospects. Here, another example of an individual from the cachette. He talks about the experience of being in the temple. I find this totally fascinating. He described the grace of the main god of the temple, the god Amun, and he says Amun causes me to be in the place of my desire. Somewhere, presumably, this man, Chnem Ibre Men, worked during his lifetime. Somewhere he spent a lot of time. In the shade of Karnak, my form in the interior of his house for eternity, united with the god's Kas, placing my Ka against the wall of his house. An indication perhaps that the statues were initially meant to be set against the walls of the temple to ensure their stability, but also intriguing because the back pillars were inscribed, presumably couldn't be read by the living, but could still be read by the gods. Because if you write something in hieroglyphs, the Medu Necher, the writings of the gods, the words of the gods are aware of those statements for eternity. And finally, the statues really materialize this sense of action. They reflect perhaps partly on the experiences of the individuals represented during life. So here a man is shown presenting, protecting, vaunting, embracing an image of the god Amun-Ra. And the function of the statue is really made explicit in the hieroglyphic inscription on either side of the figure of the god. The hieroglyphs say, "My arms are strong upon embracing your beauty, my lord, as when I was on earth, so that you may make young my body by your shining every day. You shall establish this statue, protecting your image, my name being beautiful inside your house forever, without perishing." So here there's a wonderful sense of reciprocity. I will protect your image if you protect mine. And that is absolutely typical of ancient Egyptian attitudes in general. It's partly, I think, a reflection of social realities, but also it's a monumental expectation. If you've gone to the effort of establishing a statue, paying for a statue, dedicating a statue of someone, you hope it will remain under the protection of the gods. And by being shown protecting a god, you represent this relationship, this reciprocal relationship. If I scratch your back, you can scratch mine. And again, we have statues that almost plead not just with the living, but with the gods, but reference a community. And this is something, especially recently, that I've come to appreciate about the whole corpus of Egyptian sculpture. Whereas often those realistic faces are compared unfavorably with the so-called generic faces, in fact, being part of that generic collective, ancestral collective is something which is desired. So here, someone speaks to the living, asking for the statue to be put in the place of the favored ones who repeat life. Who are the favored ones who repeat life? Well, this is a group of beings materialized by statues that are referenced also on this statue, possibly a contemporary individual. So here again, the person is speaking to the god Amun. You shall cause me to be within your noble house, among the favored ones of your Ka, your spirit. The word, ancient Egyptian word, is chesut, favored ones. And it's written, can you see, with a little hieroglyph in the shape of a little block statue, exactly the form that the statue itself takes. So it's a little reference to the form of the object upon which the inscription appears. And the ancient Egyptians love this visual play, this kind of punning. But it's a very serious and an important message that there was an expectation, a hope, a belief that you could exist forever amongst this select group, the people who were previously favored, as I said, who could still be encountered, statues that were already thousands of years old, potentially, in a temple setting. There's a real desire one feels from these texts, from these statues, of wanting to be a member of that exclusive club. And statues allow that. They allow you to be materialized in that group, that eternal collective, that ancestral collective. Here, I've quoted a line from one of these inscriptions and juxtaposed it with an unrelated but possibly contemporary depiction, a very rare depiction of the sort of thing I'm talking about. This is a priest in the act of venerating his ancestors through the form of their statues. This is as close as we can get to a snapshot of what it might have been like to wander through one of these temples, filled with faces, filled with the presence of one's ancestors. And so when we consider those realistic faces, do they represent people as they were? Do they represent great granddad as he actually was? I'm skeptical. And I'm skeptical because of the existence, especially of these types of statues. It's a category I've written about myself in the past. There are only a couple of dozen of them known as healing statues, and they are unusual because they are almost completely apart from the face, covered in text. And those texts are spells. They are magical spells to ward off danger and to treat snake bites and scorpion stings in particular. And they are a kind of a rhetorical ploy, a way in a statue-filled courtyard to get the living who are allowed into the temple to pay attention to your statue, because they go one step further. They promise to do something for the living. If you give an offering, if you pour water over one of these statues, the water will collect in a basin, which the statue is seated in, and then you can collect the water, which has been magically energized with the magical spells written in hieroglyphs covering the body of the statue, and you can use that water, that liquid, for healing. And so it encourages this level of interaction. And it is interesting, of the statues that are known, of the 7 statues with preserved faces, 2 of them have these standard, rather generic, you could say, faces, but the others have these realistic faces, not because these are what the people actually looked like. We don't know who the people were, if they were ever living people at all, but because this is a means of getting people to stop, of standing out from the crowd, of arresting someone's attention, because in a sea of these, albeit very genteel, generic, ancestral faces, something that betrayed age, experience, authority, initiation. Ancient Egypt was a gerontocracy, the respected age. It was unusual to get to an old age. So having a careworn, wrinkled, creased face was something special. It doesn't relate to anything anyone necessarily looked like. It represents the purposes of the statue, a means of getting you to pay attention to it in the setting of a functioning temple. And so to conclude, I really wonder whether when we encounter these really incredible, jaw-dropping faces from the past in the form of the so-called Fayum portraits, whether we're not also encountering a later version of the same, whether perhaps these are faces which we know that it's likely that those Roman period, first into the second, into even the third century CE, those mummified individuals had these painted representations of faces on them. And there's good evidence that they were initially, before burial, set up in a context for veneration. The excavator Flinders Petrie assumed that these would be domestic contexts. That's rather doubtful now. It may have been a kind of chapel setting. But what we're seeing here is a way of getting people's attention. It does not necessarily relate to what the person looked like in life. If at least I can say, if anything, they're improving rather on reality, because most of the so-called Fayum portrait panels show people as young and relatively attractive to a modern eye. But when we look at faces like this beguiling young man now in the collection of Manchester Museum, or this lady now in the collection of the Getty Museum, we are getting an insight not just into a personality and a face and an artist's skill, but we may be getting something of the rhetoric of wanting to maintain that relationship with the living, of wanting the living to stop and pay attention to you in a room full of statues, a courtyard full of sculptures, or in a chapel even full of the mummified dead that have these very striking eternal faces. With that, I hope I've given some extra insights into the sorts of material that you can encounter in the exhibition currently at the Getty Museum. I hope to visit the exhibition in person myself before it closes in 2027. If you want to know more about my thoughts on this subject, as ever, when people talk about their research, it's a work in progress. But the work I've done on the Karnak cachette, I'm writing up for a series in Brepols, and I hope that will see fruition soon. And the work on our modern assumptions about faces in particular and facial reconstruction will hopefully appear in the next couple of years with Manchester University Press. You can follow me on social media, on Instagram, on X, on Threads, whatever your chosen mode or medium is, at EgyptMCR. And finally, if you would like to know some initial thoughts from a kind of popular, what people have asked me in cocktail bars and barber shops over the last 15, 20 years or so, this book is out next month. In the UK, at least, I'm assured there will be a US and international release soon. So all that it remains for me to say is thank you ever so much for your attention, and I'm happy to take some questions. So, A good question I see initially is, would these sculptures have been painted? Excellent point. Yes. Um, this is something we have noted, especially in limestone sculpture. Limestone, of course, is a lighter stone, more porous, and it takes paint and a kind of a gesso primer quite easily. The material I talked about coming from the Karnak cachette is interesting because a lot of that material was originally made of limestone and was lost because the find context was waterlogged. Because of the annual flood of the Nile River, the water table destroyed a lot of the softer stones and the wooden sculpture that once must have been in the cachette and would have been painted, decorated, gilded, and the action of the water has damaged or destroyed it. And we have a bias in the preserved evidence because what survives is hard stones, granodiorite, granite, quartzite. So I think even sculptures made of granite may have had details, yeah, picked out in paint. So that's a really good question. Gosh, there are lots of questions. Um, a good one from Deborah. Who uh, integrated the class of sculptors? So the people making the statues, did it include any women? We don't have any definitive evidence that I'm aware of for female sculptors. Those that survive, in terms of the evidence we know of, are male. Um, but I think actually, and that is a really interesting question and a point of perception, those people who were sculpting these images, yes, were very skilled, and some of these perceptions I mentioned, H.R. Hall and Bottmer and other commentators really focus on the individual skill of the sculptor as if it was one person's work. We know from other contexts that Egyptian artworks, Egyptian uh, creative endeavor was often collective. And so we may not really be thinking about the master sculptor. You're not talking necessarily about a Michelangelo, um, you know, someone one singularly conceptualizing and executing a sculpture. I would like to think because women were priestesses and sculptors were initiated and in some level priestly staff themselves that potentially they could have included women, but uh, I'm not able to point to any definitive evidence. Um, a more general question about how do Egyptologists date sculptures? So with stone sculpture, with a wooden sculpture, you could do, you could take a radiocarbon date. But remember, you'd be assuming that the sculpture was carved newly from a newly felled tree bit of wood. So even if you did have a wooden sculpture, you might be dating the wood and not the execution of the sculpture. Um, Stone is almost exclusively stylistic, and there are certain things which are relatively dead giveaways for a piece from the late Old Kingdom, from the late Middle Kingdom, from the mid 18th dynasty, from the reign of Akhenaten, but when you encounter material as in the Getty show from, say, the 26th dynasty that employs this conscious, conspicuous archaism, this deliberate quotation of the past, you have to ask yourself, is this a conscious copy of an old style, or is it in fact an old an older sculpture? Is it the prototype? In fact, it's not just a copy of the prototype, it's the original, if you like. So that assessment of stone sculpture tends to be stylistic. Um, so I'm going to take this last question because there are so many, and it's a good one from Sandy. So The person was dead when they were sculpted. This is something I've wrestled with for a while. Yes, I think that was the default situation, except for the super rich who could have multiple statues of themselves, in which case they were setting them up by themselves. Um, but yes, I think. Sorry, I'll just go back to that, Sandy. Sorry. Uh, so Sandy says, do you think the sculpture used their Uncle Harry as a model? No, I don't. Um, although I like to put the point that Sandy makes. Why did the sculptor want his statue to stand out like a resume? So some of the inscriptions on statues do read like resumes, like CVs. But in some ways, they're boasting not just to the living, but to the gods as a kind of qualification to get into the afterlife. But hopefully, as I suggested, the point was, in fact, counter to our modern expectations. The point was not to represent someone as they actually were, because as someone really appeared, was not as important as being part of this ancestral collective of successful statues from the past, or simply having an old looking face as a way of attracting attention and standing out the crowd. So you have two kind of poles there. You have the standing out with the realistic face, or you have the generic face that belongs to this general group of statues from the past. But even the realistic faces themselves might reference statues from the past. In none of these situations was it important, I think, for the ancient Egyptians to show someone as a living, breathing, photorealistic likeness. I know it's a flippant thing to say, but obviously we're talking about a world way before photographic technology, where very few people, could even have access to anything like a reliable mirror. So your attitude to your own face would be very different to the modern idea of, everyone gets up in the morning and sees their face in the mirror if they want to or not. So yeah, it's a really good point, but fundamental bottom line, I do not think nothing from the sculptural corpus of ancient Egypt has convinced me that the faces represent people as they actually were, or were an attempt to render people as they actually walked around. Very finally, I would say there are really some excellent questions there. I hope there are some familiar faces in the question and answer session. I'll get a transcript, I think, of those and hopefully be able to contact those people I know individually. But thank you again for your attention.
Thank you so much, Campbell, for this fascinating talk. And thank you to all of you in the audience for joining us today. I hope today's presentation has prompted you to view Egyptian art through a new perspective the next time you visit a museum. And we certainly encourage you to come visit us at the Getty Villa and see the exhibition, Sculpted Portraits from Ancient Egypt, which is on view here until January of 2027. So thank you all again.
Thank you.